Hello! This time we will explain the plot of the film titled Landmine Goes Click, released in 2015. The film tells the story of three friends who go on a vacation to a remote mountainous area, but behind the peaceful natural surroundings lies hidden resentment, betrayal, and violence that turn their vacation into a nightmare. When one of them steps on a landmine, everything turns into a cruel and high-pressure psychological game. Here's the plot summary. There are three friends named Chris, Daniel, and Alicia who are on vacation in the mountains of Georgia. They drive through narrow roads surrounded by dense trees, with a cool and quiet natural landscape. In the middle of the journey, Daniel stops the car and gets out for a moment, moving away from the vehicle. Chris then talks to Alicia about the possibility of revealing their relationship to Daniel, but Alicia refuses to discuss it. Daniel is Alicia's fiancé, while Chris is Daniel's close friend who joined the trip. Upon arriving at the top of a cliff, they stopped for a moment to enjoy the vast natural scenery. In the midst of the peaceful atmosphere, Daniel suddenly proposed something surprising. He wanted to formalize his engagement with Alicia right there, with Chris as a witness. But Chris seemed unhappy with the idea. His expression changed. He looked annoyed and reluctant to get involved in the moment. The next morning, Chris wakes up and steps out of the tent, only to find a stranger rummaging through their bags. Without thinking, he attacks the man, beating him while shouting that he's a thief. The man tries to explain, asking for help and introducing himself as Davy, a forest ranger. However, since Chris doesn't recognize him, he continues to beat him relentlessly. Shortly after, Alicia and Daniel rushed over to intervene, explaining that Davy was their friend and that they had indeed asked him to retrieve the camera. Upon hearing this, Chris fell silent and apologized to Davy for his mistake. After the situation calms down, Davy takes the camera out of his bag and suggests taking a photo of the three of them as a keepsake. As Alicia shows Davy how to use the camera, Daniel directs Chris to the right position for the photo. The three of them began adjusting their positions, trying to look neat and balanced within the frame. However, just as they were ready, an odd clicking sound came from under Chris's feet. The sound immediately tensed the atmosphere. Davy immediately realized something was wrong. With a serious tone, he asked everyone to stay still. He looked at Chris's feet anxiously and said that he had probably stepped on something very dangerous, a landmine. Chris panicked, his body trembling, but Davy tried to calm him down and assure him that the only way to stay safe was to not move at all. The tension escalated, and eventually all three realized that this was no joke. With a firm voice, Davy directs Daniel and Alicia to move away from Chris's position and head behind a large rock for their safety. Daniel then tells Davy to immediately seek help. In the midst of the panic, Daniel also asked Alicia to move away, leaving him with Chris, who was still standing stiffly on the mine. With heavy steps, Alicia finally went behind the rock, obeying her fiancé's request. However, Alicia pleads with Daniel to come with her and move away from Chris. An argument ensues, but after a tense standoff, Daniel reluctantly follows Alicia and leaves Chris standing on the landmine. Shortly after they move away, the sound of a ringtone is heard, indicating that the signal has returned. Full of hope, Daniel immediately tries to call for help, explaining the situation they are facing in detail, hoping someone will come to rescue them soon. However, after ending the call, his expression changes and he stares at Alicia coldly, saying that they cannot save someone who has destroyed his trust. Alicia was utterly shocked. The words felt like a slap. At that moment, she realized that Daniel already knew about the secret relationship between her and Chris. Daniel finally expressed his disappointment to Chris and Alicia, glaring at both of them before giving a cold smile, a smile that hinted at suppressed anger. With a calm yet pressured voice, he began explaining that none of this was a coincidence, as he had known for a long time about the secret relationship between his best friend and the woman he wanted to marry. Remaining calm, Daniel lifts his phone and shows that the ringing sound they heard earlier wasn't due to a signal, but because he had set it up to create false hope, and it was all part of his plan. Without saying much, Daniel walked toward the bushes and returned with a shovel in his hand. He then suggested to Alicia to start digging a trench, whether as a hiding place or perhaps as a grave for Chris. He also added that the idea came from Davy. Alicia is shocked and disbelieving at what she has just heard. Trembling, she asks why Daniel is doing all this. Daniel stares at her intently and answers bitterly that it is because the love he has cherished with all his heart has been betrayed by the woman he wanted to marry. The argument between them escalated once more, and in the end, without a word of farewell, Daniel left Alicia and Chris behind, leaving the two of them trapped in a terrifying situation. Alicia began to panic. The tense situation made her lose control, but Chris tried to stay calm. With a soft yet firm voice, he tried to calm Alicia down and asked her to step back to avoid getting involved in a situation that could cost her life. But Alicia refuses to leave Chris alone, even offering to take his place, though it's clearly impossible. Finally, with unwavering determination, Alicia goes to find the safety key for the landmine, which had been removed earlier by Daniel. A few moments later, Alicia returned with the key, hoping it could deactivate the landmine, threatening Chris's life. With trembling hands and irregular breathing, Alicia tried to insert the key into the landmine's mechanism. However, after the key is inserted, the situation becomes even more tense. Both of them are trapped in a psychological battle over whether the key has truly deactivated the mine or will instead trigger an explosion. At this moment, fear engulfs both of them. They are frozen, panicking, and no one dares to test the key's effectiveness. Hours passed, but the situation grew increasingly uncontrollable. Chris remained standing on the mine, his eyes filled with anxiety. He felt utterly hopeless, his body growing weary from standing motionless, while Alicia, filled with worry, tried to find a way to help, but all her efforts were in vain. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and a stranger emerged from behind the rocks, accompanied by a dog. Without hesitation, the dog ran toward Chris and Alicia. Alicia was worried that the dog might trigger the landmine or endanger Chris, so she tried to shoo it away. However, this action angered the stranger. He quickly approached and pointed a gun at Alicia, then forbade her from touching his dog. A heated argument ensued. In the tension, Alicia tried to explain that Chris was on a landmine and couldn't move at all. However, the stranger didn't believe her, instead accusing them of burying a body there. Chris and Alicia looked at each other in confusion before finally explaining their situation calmly and coherently. After a while, the stranger began to understand the real situation. At first glance, it seemed as though he could be a new hope for them, but that hope slowly faded as the stranger began to laugh softly. His gaze grew sharp, as though he saw an opportunity to enjoy others' suffering. He begins to tease Alicia, asking about her relationship with Chris, then making provocative statements that escalate the tension. Alicia feels extremely uncomfortable, but the stranger doesn't care at all about her feelings. Shortly after, the man ordered Alicia to come closer and speak privately. With a manipulative tone, he offered to help save Chris, but with an unreasonable condition. He also asked what he would get in return. When his request was refused, Chris tried offering cash and a credit card, hoping the man would be satisfied, but the offer was rejected. The stranger insisted that he wanted Alicia as a form of service exchange. In desperation and under immense pressure, Alicia finally accepted the offer reluctantly. In return, the stranger began digging the ditch as requested earlier, but all under degrading conditions for Alicia. He forced her to do humiliating things and treated her inhumanely. Every time Alicia refused, he threatened that help would only be provided if she complied with all his demands. The foreign man finally introduced himself as Ilya, then pulled out a walkie-talkie from his bag and tried to offer the same game that felt odd to Alicia and Chris. The offer was immediately rejected by Alicia, but Ilya persisted, even calling one of his companions via the walkie-talkie to try to intimidate and psychologically pressure Alicia and Chris. In a desperate situation with no other choice, Alicia and Chris began to be tempted to play along for their safety, but Ilya's demands became increasingly unreasonable. He began to threaten Alicia with a gun while asking her to do things that humiliated her. Alicia holds back her fear and confusion, while Chris doesn't stay silent. He tries to talk to Ilya to divert his attention and offer something else in exchange. In the midst of the chaos, Alicia takes advantage of an opening and flees into the forest. As night falls, Ilya and his dog immediately give chase, while Chris, witnessing the scene, panics. He spots the gun lying nearby and, with caution, uses a small chain to pull it slowly toward him, keeping his feet still due to the threat of landmines. Finally, he managed to grab the gun. However, before he could take any action, Ilya returned, dragging Alicia, who appeared to be in a weakened state. Chris immediately aimed the gun at him, but Ilya remained calm, as he was holding a knife and keeping Alicia close to his body, using her as a human shield. At this point, Chris was unable to pull the trigger, fearing he might harm Alicia. Taking advantage of Chris's fear, Ilya pulls Alicia behind the rocks. Soon after, screams echo from the distance, signaling that something terrible is happening, but Chris can only hold back his anger and guilt. A few moments later, Ilya reappeared from behind the rocks. Seeing his chance and with anger boiling over, Chris didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, and the bullet fired quickly, striking Ilya, whose body collapsed onto the ground. After that, Chris woke up in a weakened state, finding himself lying next to Alicia's lifeless body. Ilya stood nearby, revealing that the landmine Chris had stepped on was actually inactive. It was merely part of Daniel's revenge plan. Ilya then left, leaving Chris in deep sorrow. Sometime later, Chris arrived at a remote village in Georgia, where he met Tanya and her daughter Laika. They invited him inside their house and served him food. While they were eating, Ilya, who turned out to be Tanya's husband and Lika's father, returned home. Upon seeing Chris, he was shocked and tried to politely escort him out. However, Chris returned to their house carrying Ilya's pet dog, claiming he had accidentally hit it. Seeing this, Ilya became enraged and threatened Chris with a rifle, but Chris had already drawn his ammunition. With the gun already prepared, Chris shot both of Ilya's legs, rendering him helpless. Chris, consumed by revenge and deep emotional pain over Alicia's death, eventually found the house where Tanya and Lika lived. They were people who were close to Ilya. With a cold expression and firm steps, Chris forced them into the house. Inside, the atmosphere became tense, merciless, and devoid of compassion. Chris began interrogating them. He accused them of knowing about the atrocities committed by Ilya and considered them part of the crime, but they denied it, causing Chris to grow even more enraged. Under intense psychological pressure, he forces Lika to perform a deeply degrading act, a form of punishment mirroring what Alicia had endured. When Lika refuses, Chris takes the game to a darker and more dangerous level, ordering them to play Russian roulette, a deadly game using a pistol. The tension in the room becomes unbearable as the trigger is pulled one by one. At this point, Chris can no longer distinguish between justice and revenge. Finally, in an inevitable and terrifying moment, the bullet fires when it's Lika's turn, and she dies instantly. The scene mirrors the depth of the psychological destruction Chris has undergone, now becoming a figure not unlike the monster who once destroyed his life. After the tragic incident, Chris sits in a corner of the room, surrounded by Tanya's sobs and Ilya's cries of pain. The film ends with a scene of a man shattered by guilt and revenge, showing that revenge does not bring peace, but only prolongs the cycle of suffering. Chris exits the house with heavy steps, still holding a gun in his hand. Inside the house, Tanya cries in fear, and Lika lies lifeless, yet Chris feels no relief, only emptiness. He looks around, where the atmosphere is silent, cold, and nothing remains. This time, his revenge was complete, but his soul was shattered. In that place, everything ended, and a part of himself was buried alongside Alicia. And the film ends. Thank you for following this story. I thoroughly enjoyed this film and hope to share my experience and the plot of other films with you. Thank you.